Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility in a frigid Appalachia this morning. But I know the rest of the country is experiencing the same thing we are. But when I got up this morning, the temperature was 17 degrees. Well, I went out to visit a friend earlier this morning in spite of the roads, which are terrible. And it was 14 degrees, and now I just grabbed the sandwich at noon and watched the noon news on television, and it's now 11 degrees here, and it's going to continue to get colder this evening. We're looking at a wind chill tonight, about 20 below, minus 20 or something in that area. It looks like the temperature itself is going to go down 1 or 2 degrees at least below zero this evening. So it's unbelievable. We have probably 5 inches of snow on the ground, and of course the forecasts were that we would have snow flurries, but no meaningful accumulation. Well, we're about 5 inches of snow right now. At this moment, it has stopped snowing, but this is the first time all day that it has not been snowing. So anyway, I hope that you are warm and cozy where you are, and Bob and I have been sharing concerns and kind of griping back and forth at each other about how cold it is and how cold we are and all of this. The room that I'm broadcasting from was at one point, when the house was built, a porch, an exterior porch, which has been framed in, but there's no insulation in it. So consequently, it's very, very difficult to keep this room warm in the wintertime. I have a heater in here, but as much heat as it puts out, of course, you lose it. And the alternative is in the summertime, because it's unbearably hot here because it's a flat roof. So we have that dual issue. And Bob is experiencing the same kind of thing as I know those of you who listen to the Horn regularly are aware. Bob's studio is not well heated either. So between the two of us, we're struggling. But the show must go on, as they say. And I was determined to do a program today, despite the weather. I mentioned that I was on the road early this morning. I have a good friend who is my neighbor who's lived across the street since I moved here. I've known him for going on 23 years, and it's 23 years now this month. And he was living here when I came here. And he went into a retirement home about 6 weeks ago. And I visited him 2 times up there, and he had a bad turn, and he's now at hospice house here in Beckley. And so I made up my mind when I heard he was there. I made up my mind to go over and see him this morning. So weather be damned, I got in the car and I made it out there to the hospice house, and it was the highlight of my day because he was wonderful. A couple of days out there with a good night's sleep and good food and all of that. He's really made a remarkable recovery. He just looked wonderful, and it really kind of made my day. Then I struggled to get back in time for our program. So I know you didn't tune in to listen to my woes. I've already obviously killed 3 or 4 minutes of your valuable time with my personal stories, and I apologize. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility, and I emphasize that last part, civic responsibility, because an awful lot of what we do here at the Virtual Center focuses on the role of citizens in this republic. And much of the work that we've done with the Federalist Papers and with the Constitution and with the history of the period and different interpretations of the period and the rest of it is basically trying to get our arms around the very complicated but so important nature of citizenship, the civic responsibility that is associated with Republican government. And that, as you know, in our previous programs, we looked at Montesquieu and looked at Montesquieu's idea of Republican government and what the role of citizen and civic responsibility is in a republic, and the degree to which a an efficiently and effectively functioning republic requires something that the founders referred to as civic virtue, the willingness to put one's self-interest aside in the interests of what's good for everybody, the public interest, so to speak. And that's what we've been looking at here at the Virtual Center off and on throughout our time together, has been trying to examine and better understand the role of citizenship in this republic. I believe, and again, I'm just kind of throwing this out for your consideration, I believe that the work that we've done over the last 3 programs on the judicial branch of government, as articulated in Alexander Hamilton's Federalist papers, number 78, 79, and today we're going to look at 80 and 81, hopefully. One of the things that you see kind of implied or between the lines, so to speak, is a much more precise idea of citizenship, of civic virtue in this republic. Hamilton's vision for the courts is so important. I think, the more I think about this, the more I've come to the conclusion that despite the fact that Hamilton opens Federalist number 78 by talking about how weak the judicial branch is and reassuring people that they have little to fear from the court system, from the judicial branch, because it has no weapons at its disposal. In comparing it with the executive branch and with the legislative branch, Hamilton makes the point that the executive branch has the sword. It administers and enforces the law. The legislative branch has the purse. It passes the law and funds them. But the judicial branch has neither of those, and therefore, in order to fulfill and carry out its decisions, it must depend on support from the other branches. So Hamilton makes the point that the concerns about the courts, more specifically about the power of judicial review, are, in his view, ill-founded. But the fact of the matter is, when you read what Hamilton is saying about the vision, the role that he envisions for the courts, it is absolutely clear the incredibly critical role that the courts play in the success of this republic. We talked yesterday in looking at revisiting Federalist number 78. We looked yesterday at the role of the courts in protecting minority interests in this republic. We yesterday focused on the fact that by minority interests, Hamilton seemingly had something much more specific in mind than just majority and minority in the abstract sense. When Hamilton was talking about minority rights, he was talking about the threats that majority rule poses to the property, to the wealthy, to the influential, to the considerate, to the so-called disinterested, those people that Hamilton believes you have to have supporting this republic, because only the wealthy, only the few, can remain disinterested enough to put the public interest first, always. And of course the reality is, if you think about it, since these people are at the top of the totem pole theoretically anyway, it stands to reason that in supporting the public interest, in supporting the system, these people are in effect supporting their own self-interest. So the irony of the situation is, if you take Hamilton and Madison both and you manipulate their thinking a little bit, it becomes clear that in their minds the private interests of the few are the public. That is the public interest. Is the system, the preservation of the system that enabled these people to reach the levels that they have reached. And stands to reason then that if you bring these people into government, their number one priority is going to be to promote their own self-interest, which is to preserve the very system that allowed them to be so successful. And of course, in the views of Madison and Hamilton and the others, this is the public interest. This system is the best for the most people, they genuinely believe. And so the irony, and this is the point I'm making here about Federalist number 78, it's very obvious to me as you begin to really wrap your arms around the role that Hamilton envisions for the courts. It's very clear to me that there's some question whether in fact his explanation of the weakness and dependence of the courts is a little bit overstated, because in effect, given the role that the courts are to play in this system, the courts are not weak or inconsequential at all. They are quite significant. And as I mentioned yesterday, and I want to reiterate today, it is only in doing these programs over the last week to 10 days that I have begun to appreciate the significance of the court within our separation of powers system more than I ever have before. I was aware that Hamilton and Madison and the others believed and said more than once that we had little to fear from the courts because they were the weakest branch. They had to depend on the other branches to fulfill or to carry out their decisions. But the fact of the matter is, if you read 78 very carefully, one must question exactly how weak the courts really are. Because in effect, by establishing the independence of the judges, by establishing a salary that cannot be diminished, and lifelong appointments which only can be terminated via impeachment or death, then the fact of the matter is you have created a very powerful force within this republic to define and to uphold the rule of law. And of course, the reality, political reality of the situation is that if you make the rule of law your priority, in other words, if this system is one in which everybody, irrespective of who they are, must operate within the confines of the rule of law, then that goes a long way towards preserving, or towards, first of all, towards defining the public interest, and secondly, towards preserving it. In other words, rule of law directly supports the public interest as defined by the founders. And that public interest is Republican government in which the interests of the minority are defined and protected by an independent judiciary. I think, to me, this is very meaningful analysis, and it's the kind of analysis that you really can't get until you get into the primary sources themselves. And so far, we've gone into Federalists number 78 and 79. What I'd like to do today is continue with this on this judicial track by looking at Federalist 80 and Federalist 81. And then maybe next week, when we come back together again, we can consider Federalist number 82 as well. But at this point, it seems to me the most we could hope to accomplish today would be 80 and 81. I look forward to hearing from you and getting your ideas, your thoughts, your concerns, your observations about the role of the courts, about the nature of the republic, about the vision expressed in number 78 and 79 by Hamilton. I'd really be interested, because much of what I've said is obviously interpretation based on the primary sources. It seems to me that the more you reflect and the more you analyze, the more you, and this is a term that educators use all the time, the more you engage the sources and wrestle with what they say and to deduce what they say really means, the more you begin to understand and see the ramifications and the implications and the connections that link this republic together. And that's really what we're about here at the Virtual Center. I would love to hear your ideas, your thoughts on the courts themselves or on the Virtual Center in general. We have a phone number that has been reserved specifically for your use. It is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. 4676 translates on your keypad to horn, H-O-R-N. So if you are inclined to remember that way, it's 304-663-HORN. If you'd like to email me directly, I'm more than happy to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you, and I commit to the fact that I will make every effort to respond to what you tell me or what you ask or what you indeed assert in your emails. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, BRIEN, 906@gmail.com. One of the things that occurred to me just prior to going on the air today, I was looking at I'll be very honest with you, I was just checking on the stock market numbers before we went on the air, and I clicked into the New York Times on the internet in order to check just to see what the stock market was doing today, because as you know, the stock market has declined precipitously for a couple of sessions in a row. As of now, the Dow is up almost 200 points, so it looks like for at least temporarily, the free fall in the Dow has pretty much been reversed. And of course, most experts associate or allude to the decline in oil prices as being the basis for the decline in the market. Those people who have invested in oil are obviously being hurt with the continued fall in oil prices and gasoline prices. And as of yesterday, you probably know that the price on the open market for a barrel of crude was $47 and change, which is less than half that it was even 6 months ago. So this is reverberating in the stock market. And I was kind of interested to see whether in fact that trend was continuing or whether in fact maybe it has bottomed out. And at least so far today, the Dow was up 196 points when I looked at it about 25 minutes ago. So it's possible that we have hit the bottom in that particular issue. However, one of the things that I noticed in looking at the New York Times, of course, was the headline and the horrendous slaughter that occurred in Paris today, where 12 people were killed in a terrorist raid against a newspaper in Paris. And the media, at least so far, is drawing connections between this is France's version of 9/11, that in other words, France has not really experienced what we experienced in 9/11, and this gives them some idea of what we're talking about. But the fact of the matter is this newspaper, this particular paper that was attacked today, has been on alert for some time because they have a history of running some pretty inflammatory stuff about Islam, about Muhammad, They've run some cartoons and captions related to Muhammad that has caused that has rankled Muslims around the world, and consequently, this newspaper has been on alert for some time. And of course, the frightening part of it is that this particular terrorist attack yesterday indicates how very difficult it is to plug all the holes and stop committed terrorists. Again, what I was thinking about as we went on the air today in this particular attack is the program we did a couple of weeks ago on civil religion, and then the programs that we did the other day based on the lecture on the extent to which maybe in the future we're looking at a religion built or based upon the idea of evolution. I referred to the lecture that Horst sent me from Taiwan, and we basically devoted pretty much about more than half of a full program here at the Virtual Center to this issue of finding ways to reinstill the principles that are usually associated with religion into the world's operative framework, if you will. It seems to me that as we experience more and more terror, and as the world reacts, and of course the problem, a problem, not the only problem, but a problem with terror is it usually begets more terror. And somehow you got to find a way to break that cycle. And I think something approaching a search for those things that all people have in common, whether they be Christians, whether they be Muslim, whether they be Jews, whether they be Hindu, whether they be Buddhist or whatever. If we could begin to emphasize the kinds of things that these folks have in common rather than the things that divide them, we might be able to diffuse the hatred and some of the hatred and the bigotry that exists, unfortunately, in our world. So it was just a thought as we came on the air today. Anyway, we're at 22 minutes after the hour, so I'm ready, if you are, to get back into the Federalist Papers, more specifically to begin looking at Federalist number 80. And yesterday, if you were with us in our abbreviated program yesterday, you may recall that we spent the last 10 minutes of yesterday's program looking at a kind of overview of Federalist number 80 with a promise that we would get into the nitty-gritty and into the details of Federalist 80 in today's program. So I'm ready to do that. And again, if you have questions or you have issues that you would like to bring to the fore, by all means, I invite you to pick up the phone and give us a call at 304-663-4676 and give us all an opportunity to share in your thinking at the moment. With that, let's begin to look at Alexander Hamilton's position on Federalist number 80, which is entitled "The Judiciary Continued and the Distribution of the Judicial Authority." If you look in the paper, in the New York newspapers, as these Federalist papers appeared one after the other, each of them was addressed, as we know, to the people of the state of New York. But more important than that, besides the date, each of these papers was given a title, so that the reader, even before he begins to read that particular Federalist paper, would know whether the issue at hand was the judiciary or the legislature or the executive or foreign policy or the economy or domestic insurrection or whatever. And we've looked at a number of those in other Federalist papers we looked at. Hamilton opens Federalist number 80 by saying, "Let us now return to the petition of the judiciary authority between different courts and their relations to each other." So where Hamilton is going here is into the Constitution's distinction between the Supreme Courts and such inferior federal courts as Congress, in its wisdom, chooses to create. And it's here that Hamilton is making considered recommendations as to how Congress and how this nation should fulfill the terms of the Constitution as it relates to the structure of the federal court system which the Constitution establishes. And Hamilton begins by quoting the Constitution of the United States, and we looked at this yesterday, if you'll recall. The judicial power of the United States is, by the plan of the Convention, to be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Unquote. That's directly out of the Constitution. So the Constitution basically projects a judicial system comprised of one Supreme Court and a number of inferior courts. And the number of inferior courts is going to be determined by Congress. And then Hamilton goes into the general idea or the general reaction to the Constitution as it affects this particular issue, which is the structure of the courts. And Hamilton says that there ought to be one court of supreme and final jurisdiction is a proposition which is not likely to be contested. Translation, Hamilton says, nobody is arguing against the need for one Supreme Court, one place where the buck stops, so to speak. Nobody questions the need for that. The reasons for it, he says, have been assigned in another place and are too obvious to need repetition. The only question that seems to have been raised concerning the Supreme Court, concerning it, is whether it ought to be a distinct body or a branch of the legislature. And of course, this gets into the idea of the British Constitution, where much of the judicial function is carried out by the House of Lords. And many people point out that the British Constitution, even though it assigns the judicial responsibility to a branch of the legislature, a portion of the legislature, which is the House of Lords, it still works. And so many of the critics of the Constitution are questioning whether in fact we need an independent, separate judiciary, or whether in fact we could do the same thing that Great Britain does and assign the judicial function to the Senate, for example, or to a committee of the Senate, or something like that. Hamilton immediately points out the contradiction in this particular criticism of the Constitution. He says the same contradiction is observable in regard to this matter, which has been remarked in several other cases. The very men, he says, who object to the Senate as a court of impeachments on the ground of an improper intermixture of powers advocate, by implication at least, the propriety of vesting the ultimate decision of all cases in the whole or in part of the legislative body. What Hamilton is doing here is pointing out a contradiction in the among the critics. Because what he's saying is the very people who complain about the fact that the Senate rules on the issue of impeachment and the fact that that violates separation of powers are now coming around and saying we ought to put the ultimate decision in all cases in a part of the legislative body. And he points out that this is a contradiction, that these people are speaking out of two sides of their mouth at the same time. On the one hand, They're complaining because the Senate being involved in impeachments violates the principle of separation of powers. On the other hand, they're advocating putting the judicial function in the hands of the Senate. So what Hamilton's pointing out, that's contradictory. And he says that. And then Hamilton goes into some of the arguments of the critics. And I need to point this out. This paragraph is an extensive quotation which Hamilton does not give the citation for. In other words, Hamilton includes in the Federalist number 80 at this point an extensive quotation from somebody, somewhere, which is a criticism of the Constitution as far as the judiciary is concerned, but he doesn't basically tell us who wrote it or who says it. I am guessing that it's Robert Yates, his opponent and colleague from New York at the Constitutional Convention. And the reason I say that, because in Federalist number 78, Hamilton goes directly to criticisms made by Yates. My guess is that the inclusion of this quotation in Federalist number 80 probably comes from Yates as well. But I don't know that for sure, and I want to say that right up front. But I do want to share the criticism with you, because Hamilton obviously uses this quotation as the basis for the rest of this particular Federalist paper. So the issues that he's going to be responding to in this paper are included in this particular quote, which he uses to open the Federalist number 80. Hamilton says the arguments, or rather suggestions, upon which this charge is founded are to this effect. Quote, the authority of the proposed Supreme Court of the United States, which is to be a separate and independent body, will be superior to that of the legislature. The power of construing the laws according to the spirit of the Constitution will enable that court to mold them, to mold the laws, into whatever shape it may think proper, especially as its decisions will not be in any manner subject to the revision or correction of the legislative body. Let me stop here, because I don't want to include too much text here before we make a comment. So far, what this quotation, and again, I'm positive it's Yates, what this quotation is speaking to is that the ability of the courts, an independent court, to say what the law is, to construe the laws in the face of the Constitution, in effect, gives the court the opportunity in its interpretations of the law to make law, to create law by molding its views, the court's views, into whatever shape it thinks proper. And the fact that the courts will be able to do this, Yates says in this quote, means that the judicial branch of government becomes superior to the legislative branch. That's the issue that Hamilton has taken on in Federalist number 78. If you remember, 78 was his effort to argue that the power of judicial review does not constitute judicial supremacy. Now in number 80, what Hamilton is doing is including a specific quotation of criticism about the independent judiciary as constituting judicial supremacy under the new system. The quote goes on, the criticism goes on and says, this is as unprecedented as it is dangerous. In Britain, the judicial power in the last resort resides in the House of Lords, which is a branch of the legislature. And this part of the British government has been imitated in the state constitutions in general. Many of our state constitutions, in fact, reality is all but 4 of the state constitutions, monitor or mimic the British Constitution, copy it, by giving its upper house of its legislature the judicial function. The Parliament of Great Britain and the legislatures of the several states can at any time rectify by law the exceptionable decisions of their respective courts. But the errors and usurpations of the Supreme Court of the United States will be uncontrollable and remediless, unquote. So basically, what this criticism of the Constitution is focusing on is the presumption that the right to define the law means that the courts will be superior, supreme, to the legislative body which makes the law. And that that's really the result of an independent judiciary. And then the criticism goes on to point out that many of our state constitutions, in the spirit of the British Constitution, which allows the House of Lords to perform this judicial function, seems to function fine. But given the power that our Constitution assigns to the Supreme Court, that means that there'll be no checks, no remedy to fix decisions which the court might make in error. That's the criticism that Hamilton sets out in number 80 to take on. Obviously, he does the same thing in Federalist number 78. Translation: obviously, Hamilton believes that this anti-federalist criticism of the independent judiciary as violating the principles of legislative supremacy in a Republican government is a critical criticism that he must confront. He confronts it in number 78, and he sets out once again to confront it here in Federalist number 80. And the minute the quote ends, Hamilton says, as the last line in this paragraph of this Federalist paper, this, meaning the quote, this, upon examination, will be found to be made up altogether of false reasoning upon misconceived fact. Hamilton says straight up, here's the criticism, let me tell you right away, it's bogus. And now he's going to tell us why. And as we'll see, there are 3 major issues or arguments that Hamilton uses to refute this particular anti-federalist criticism. Number 1, Hamilton says, in the first place, there is not a syllable in the plan under consideration which directly empowers the national courts to construe the laws according to the spirit of the Constitution, or which gives them any greater latitude in this respect than may be claimed by the courts of every state. Think about that. What Hamilton is saying here is the power of judicial review is not written into the Constitution. Consequently, there's not one syllable in the Constitution which gives the court the power to construe the laws according to the spirit of the Constitution. It's assumed to be there, but it's not there in writing. So in other words, what Hamilton is doing here is using the absence of judicial review in the Constitution as a way to counter the criticism of the function that the courts will carry out in interpreting the laws and weighing them against the Constitution, against fundamental law. So the question then is Hamilton contradicting himself? In number 78, he's talking about the assumption that judicial review is there. Now he's denying that it's there. But he's not really denying that it's there. He's denying that it's there in writing. And he acknowledges that much. He said, I admit, however, that the Constitution ought to be the standard of construction for the laws, and that whenever there is an evident opposition, the laws ought to give place to the Constitution. So Hamilton says there's nothing written in the Constitution which gives the court this power, but on the other hand, I admit, he says, that the Constitution must become the standard and that the laws must be evaluated against that standard. And if the laws are found to be in opposition to the Constitution, then they must give way to the Constitution. But this doctrine, Hamilton says, is not deducible from any circumstance peculiar to the plan of the Convention, but from the general theory of a limited Constitution. Hamilton says that there's nothing in the Constitution which gives the court this power. However, the power exists in the fact that what we have is a limited Constitution. And he says, as far as it is true, it is equally applicable to most, if not to all, the state governments. In other words, he admits that while there's not one syllable in the Constitution that gives the court the power of judicial review, the fact of the matter is somebody's got to do it. Because in every state constitution somebody does it, weighs the laws being passed against the Constitution to make sure they're in sync. So obviously somebody needs to do it in the federal Constitution as well, Hamilton says. There can be no question, therefore, on this account, Hamilton says, to the federal judicature which will not lie against the local judicatures in general, and which will not serve to condemn every constitution that attempts to set bounds to legislative discretion. So what Hamilton's done there is walk a very fine line, and at the end of it, you were left in saying, wait a minute, what did he say? He says judicial review's not there, but on the other hand, he said it has to be there because that's what courts do. Somebody has to do it. And that's what judicial branches do in our state constitutions. So it stands to reason that it'll happen the same in the federal Constitution, in the U.S. Constitution. So what he says is, in effect, if you had to draw a conclusion, the power's there, but I defy you to find it in any syllable in the Constitution. And then Hamilton goes on extensively on this particular issue about the nature of the independent Supreme Court. He says, but perhaps the force of the objection may be thought to consist in the particular organization of the Supreme Court. In other words, maybe the basis of the concern of Yates's quote is in the very organization of the Supreme Court itself, in its being composed of a distinct body of magistrates, instead of being one of the branches of the legislature, as in the government of Great Britain and that of this state. To insist upon this point, the authors of the objection must renounce the meaning they have labored to annex to the celebrated maxim requiring a separation of the departments of power. Now this is a very effective argument in debate. What you try to do is refute your opponent. What Hamilton is doing here is refuting the quote, which is the criticism of the independent judiciary. And he said, maybe the basis of the criticism is not the power of the court. Maybe it's based on the organization of the court. Maybe the issue is that by having a distinct body of judges, of magistrates sitting on the court, maybe that's the issue. And then he says, to insist on that, then the people who are doing the objection must in turn renounce their support for the principle of separation of powers. You can't have it both ways, is what he's saying. If you want the judicial power to be located in the legislature, then you cannot have it and still claim to support the idea of separation of powers. If you insist on the importance of the separation of powers, Hamilton is saying, then you can't quibble about the independent judiciary because that's the only way to do it. So in a sense, what he's done is he's painted his critics into a corner in what I think is brilliant rhetoric. He's done this brilliantly. But again, I ask you to consider how much of this meaning would the average person get from reading Federalist number 80, or Federalist number 78, or Federalist number 10, or Federalist number 51, or Federalist number 39, or any of the others that we've defined or we've identified as key Federalist papers? This is written and argued at a level of abstraction that makes the meaning very, very vague and very, very abstract and difficult to understand, especially among people who don't read really well. Because in order to really understand what he's saying, you have to get into the text and you've got to extract the meaning from the words and the way that the words are expressed. The irony is you got to do the same kind of thing that Antonin Scalia says you must do in his support of originalism. You've got to get back into the heads of the founders in order to understand or know what they meant when they wrote the Constitution the way it was written. So I think what we're seeing here is that Antonin Scalia could be considered guilty of the same kinds of contradictions that Hamilton accuses Yates and his other anti-federalist opponents of having when it comes to this particular aspect of the Constitution. After he finishes pointing out the contradiction about if you're going to have the legislature or part of the legislature perform the judicial function, then you got to abandon your support for the maxim of separation of powers. And then Hamilton goes on. It shall nevertheless, he says, be conceded to them agreeably to the interpretation given to that maxim in the course of these papers, that it is not violated by vesting the ultimate power of judging in a part of the legislative body. And part is emphasized, the word part. In other words, he's admitting here that you're not talking about the entire legislature performing the judicial function. You're talking about a portion, a part of it. And he admits that if you assign it to a part of the legislative body, you are not necessarily violating the maxim of separation of powers. But, he goes on, though this be not an absolute violation of that excellent rule, it verges so nearly upon it, as on this count alone to be less eligible than the mode preferred by the convention. In other words, it may not be totally contradictory, but on the other hand, it so resembles a contradiction that it's much easier to just abandon the whole thing about legislative involvement in judicial decisions and give it to an independent judiciary. In other words, his argument is, go with the Constitution, go with the convention, the thinking of the delegates at the convention, because when push comes to shove, what they come up with is better than what you're trying to argue. He's basically saying the critics are basically trying to prove an impossible situation. They're trying to basically say it's not a contradiction of separation of powers, but on the one hand, they insist on continuing to support the idea of separation of powers, and it creates too much, it's too close to a contradiction. Better to abandon the whole thing and just buy what the convention gave us, which is the independent judiciary. What a beautiful rhetorical argument, that Hamilton is making. Then he goes on and gives, and this is kind of the, there's one thing to stick the knife in, there's another thing to twist it. And this next line constitutes what I would argue is twisting the knife once you stab somebody. From a body which had even a partial agency in passing bad laws, we could rarely expect a disposition to temper and moderate them in the application. What he's pointing out is the reality of the contradiction. What he's saying is, if we need the judicial function because the legislature has passed a bad law, one that's in contradiction to the Constitution, then how can we expect the very same people to resolve the situation? If they passed the law that violates the Constitution, how in good conscience can we turn around and expect them to right the wrong? That, he says, borders on absurdity. Still less, wait a minute, I'm jumping ahead here. The same spirit which had operated in making them and making the laws would be too apt in interpreting them. Still less could it be expected that men who had infringed the Constitution in the character of legislators would be disposed to repair the breach in the character of judges. In other words, he's pointing out the blatant contradiction and inconsistency when you have the same people that pass the laws interpreting them and making changes if changes is called for, because by definition, if these people were involved in passing the law, then they obviously didn't see a contradiction. So why would we turn to them and expect them to fix any contradictions that exist when they are the ones that did it? So Hamilton is pointing out this is blatant, patently absurd. So consequently, Hamilton is saying we better abandon this whole idea of the legislature doing this, because all we're doing is creating more trouble than it's worth. And then he goes on and he adds to this, and he says, nor is this all. There's more. Every reason which recommends the tenure of good behavior for judicial offices militates against placing the judiciary power in the last resort in a body composed of men chosen for a limited period. Now comes into the issue of the extent to which elected members of the legislature, representatives, are vulnerable to getting reelected. They do not have lifetime tenure. And so consequently, the fact that their job is always on the line means that they always have one eye on the political realities of their own self-interest. So not only does he point out that it's incredibly inconsistent or naive to believe that the people who created the problem are going to fix it, so also he says that every common sense argument in favor of an independent judiciary that serves for good behavior, in other words, for life, militates against the common sense which dictates lifetime appointments, suggests that placing the judiciary power in a body of men chosen for a limited period is stupid. He says there is an absurdity in referring the determination of causes in the first instance to judges of permanent standing, in the last to those of a temporary and mutable constitution. And there is a still greater absurdity in subjecting the decisions of men selected for their knowledge of the laws acquired by long and laborious study to the revision and control of men who, for want of the same advantage, cannot but be deficient in that knowledge. In other words, think of what we're doing if we allow the legislature to perform the judicial function. We are allowing the very people who created the problem to fix it. Not only that, but we're denying the interpretation of the law to people who have spent their lives studying the law, and instead we're turning that power over to people who don't have that kind of expertise. By giving it to the legislature, Hamilton is saying, we're giving it to people who are less skilled in the law. We're giving it to people who are vulnerable to political pressures of being reelected, and at the same time who don't know as much law as the people we're denying the right to the judicial function to have. When you add all of this together, this is me talking, when you add all of this together, Hamilton's argument is pretty powerful. Basically what he's saying is, there's no way in the world you can justify this. It's absurd. He said not only is it absurd, it's even more absurd when you consider the secondary points. The members of the legislature, he says, will rarely be chosen with a view to those qualifications which fit men for the stations of judges. People who are elected to be representatives are not chosen, are not voted for by the people because of their judicial expertise, their knowledge of the law. And as on this account, there will be great reason to apprehend all the ill consequences of defective information, so on account of the natural propensity of such bodies to party divisions, there will be no less reason to fear that the desistential breath of faction may poison the foundations of justice. In other words, what we're doing is basically to put what he's saying into words that we can understand. What we would be doing is we would be taking interpretations of fundamental law, the interpretation and defense of the Constitution, and we would be giving it to people who are subject to political pressures of re-election, who don't have the expertise of lifelong judges, and also who are part of political factions and parties. We're taking important legal decisions and we're allowing them to be made by people whose priorities are political rather than legal. And so consequently, Hamilton's argument is this would be absurd, patently absurd. Basically, if you think about it, what he has done by quoting Yates is take that criticism and tear it apart. He has pointed out the flaws of those criticisms of an independent judiciary. He has put to rest in Federalist number 80 all justification for the idea that a legislature or even part of a legislature, even though technically speaking it's not a contradiction of separation of powers, Hamilton is implying in real terms it is a contradiction. These considerations, Hamilton says, teach us to applaud the wisdom of those states who have committed the judicial power in the last resort, not to a part of the legislature, but to distinct and independent bodies of men. What Hamilton is coming down on here is he's praising those state constitutions which understood this and therefore created independent judiciaries rather than letting portions of their legislatures do it. And he names the constitutions that do this. And when you look at these, you begin to realize that the biggest argument in favor of Hamilton's position are that the state constitutions themselves acknowledge the value or the benefits of an independent judiciary. He said, let me read exactly what he says. Contrary to the supposition of those who have represented the plan of the convention in this respect as novel and unprecedented. In other words, he said, these people are criticizing the Constitution like we're doing something that is bizarre, that's never been done before. And then he points out, oh, are they wrong? He says it is but a copy of the constitutions of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. In other words, he has laid out, he has identified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of the 13 states that have had this good sense to create independent judiciaries. So what he's pointing out is the criticisms of this particular aspect of the Constitution are unfounded. Because while the critics argue that Great Britain gives the judicial function to the legislature, the House of Lords, and while they make the blank statement that some of the state constitutions do the same thing, Hamilton points out that of the 13, only 4 of them do this. The other 9 do exactly what we're doing in the Constitution. So therefore, he has effectively pulled the rug out totally from under the critics. That's his first argument against the criticism in the Yates quote. It is 3 minutes after the hour. We've gone beyond the top of our first hour, so let's pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll get back into Federalist number 80. And you can see how long this stuff takes. I mean, you have one page. I thought we'd get through 2 full papers today. We've only gotten through about 1/3 of Federalist number 80 in our first hour. Basically, I think what that speaks to, what that tells us, is how substantive and how important these papers are, how much is in them. But you've got to dig. You've got to read carefully and critically. You've got to engage the sources in order to extract the reasoning. If we are going to adequately educate citizens in this republic, we have got to be able to give our young people and our not so young people the skills that they need in order to be able to read and understand and extract meaning the way we're doing here. The reason I want to do this is not only because I think in terms of the information and the insight it's significant, but I also think it's an example of where we need to go in order to successfully educate our people, in order to fully carry out the responsibilities of civic responsibility in a republic. We're at 5 minutes after the hour. Let's pause for 5 minutes. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We'll pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back. Please stay with us.
With a little chant for a frozen January afternoon, we now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and thank you for the selection of music. I mentioned in a note to you that this brings back the very best part of my Catholic upbringing, I think. I think some of my more committed Catholic friends would find some problems with that statement, but there's no question that the pomp and the circumstance and the music and the glitter and the absolute wonder of the surroundings of Catholicism from the medieval period is something that one can't or should not totally ever abandon, because it's so beautiful and so wonderful. And thank you for picking that. I love it. We are at 11 minutes after the hour. We have about 50 minutes left, a little bit less, in our treatment of Federalist number 80, which I think is, if you think about the first hour and what we're doing with text, the text of Federalist number 80, it's about as far away on the spectrum from the Gregorian chant, the music that we just listened to, as one can get. From abstraction and the romanticism of the beauty of the music to the depth and the analysis and the substance and the very essence of language and meaning. And I think I guess maybe we could say that rather than, we need Hamilton to say it the way we would like to say it, but maybe what we can conclude here is that in the way we're dealing with the Virtual Center, we get it all. We get the meaning, we get the substance, we get the analysis, we get the real world meaning, and at the same time, we get the kind of abstraction and the kind of romantic beauty that goes with it. We got it all here, and it's wonderful. Welcome back to our second hour at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're looking at Federalist number 80, Hamilton's piece on the role of the Supreme Court within the Constitution of the United States. I welcome your comments, your criticisms, your suggestions, your ideas. I particularly welcome and solicit your reactions to some of my commentary, because I could stand here and read this stuff, but the fact of the matter is it's so potent, it's so meaningful, and I do feel that I'm blessed because of the years that I've spent thinking about this and reading about it, to be able to hopefully add to rather than detract from the substance and the rhetoric of the founders. I think the process of doing that is the avenue, is the road to understanding. I hope you agree. We would like to hear from you. Our phone number, and I invite you to pick up the phone and use it. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to drop an email, a line to me directly on email, I would love to hear from you as well. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien906 at gmail.com. If you are just joining us, welcome. We have begun to examine Hamilton's Federalist number 80. If you have been with us through the first hour, I would like to believe you are poised on the edge of your seats waiting for the next paragraph, if you will, in this ongoing saga at the Virtual Center. It's something that I never in my life dreamed that I would ever even attempt to do. I hope it's successful, and the only way to know it's successful is to hear about its success from you. If it's not there, please let me know. To review very quickly, if you've been with us, you remember that Hamilton opens number 80, Federalist number 80, by addressing the issue of the Supreme Court, and more particularly, he cites an extensive quote, presumably from Robert Yates, his anti-federalist colleague from New York at the Constitutional Convention. A quotation which pretty much makes the point that judicial review, the right of the courts to make the determination as to whether in fact statute law, laws passed by legislatures support and are consistent with or violate the Constitution of the United States, the fundamental law of the Republic, is a judicial function. And Yates's criticism is based on the idea that if you allow the courts to do this, then you are in effect violating legislative supremacy in the Republic in favor of judicial supremacy. And Yates goes on to point out, as part of the criticism, that Great Britain allows the House of Lords to perform the judicial function, and several of our state constitutions do the same thing. They copy that. So the fact that the British system and several of our own states assign the judicial function to a portion of the legislative branch suggests that it is not necessary to have an independent judiciary comprised of independent judges who serve for life. That's the quote. That's the argument that Hamilton is taking on in Federalist number 80. And as I mentioned, he really uses three major arguments to refute that. So far, we have covered the first one, which is the inconsistency and the apparent contradiction that exists among critics who advocate legislative involvement in judicial decision-making, namely the right of a portion of the legislative branch, similar to Great Britain, to perform the judicial function. And on the other hand, these same people continue to advocate for the idea of separation of powers. Hamilton's whole point is you can't have it both ways, guys. If you're going to insist on legislative involvement in judicial decisions, then you've got to abandon your commitment to the idea of separation of powers. And Hamilton makes some qualifications, but basically he argues against the expertise of those serving in the legislature. He said the members who are elected to the legislature aren't elected because of their wisdom in the law, because of their judicial expertise. They're elected because of their ability to appeal to the electorate. Their terms of office are short-term. They are constantly vulnerable to political decision-making. They belong to factions and political parties, which means that all sorts of issues outside and not related directly to the judicial function would go into their decisions if we did that. And in the process, we would be losing the wisdom of men who have spent their entire lives studying the law. And of course, Hamilton's whole point is when you think about all that together, it's absurd to even consider surrendering an independent judiciary in favor of legislative involvement in interpreting the law. And then at the end, he kind of, the coup de grace, if you will, the last straw, if you will, is Hamilton points out that if you look at who does allow the legislatures to participate with the House of, in the model or in copying the House of Lords, only 4 of the 13 states' constitutions do this. And he names the 9 states that have been wise enough in their state constitutions to create independent judiciaries. So in effect, he blows holes in the criticism. It's interesting, as an aside, it's interesting that the entire Federalist Papers, all 85 of them, are basically intended to refute the powers of the states under the Articles. Yet it stands to reason, as here, that when it suits your argument, you go to the states and the wisdom of the state's constitution when it suits you, as well as criticize them when it doesn't. So I think, in that sense, I think we have to give Hamilton his due. He's flexible enough to know that when it fits when you can use it, you praise the state constitution. But when the state constitution is the problem, you're more than ready to attack it. And I think Hamilton does that. So that's the first argument that Hamilton uses to refute the Yates quote. In the second position, Hamilton says, it is not true in the second place that the Parliament of Great Britain or the legislatures of the particular states can rectify the exceptionable decisions of their respective courts in any other sense than might be done by a future legislature of the United States. What Hamilton is into here is a major point, and that is that while the House of Lords is involved in judicial decision-making in Great Britain, and while the legislature is involved in judicial decision-making in some of our states, as we learned from Hamilton, only 4 of them, the fact of the matter is, in none of those situations, can the legislature actually overturn a particular decision. The only thing that they can do is pass a new law making sure that the mistakes that were made in that case will not be made again. In other words, the legislatures who do participate in judicial decision-making cannot infringe or intrude within a particular case. All they can do is pass a law to make sure it won't happen again. So Hamilton is pretty much qualifying the legislative function within judicial decision-making, even in those places where it happens. The theory, neither of the British nor the state constitutions, Hamilton says, authorizes the revisal of a judicial sentence by a legislative act, nor is there anything in the proposed constitution more than in either of them by which it is forbidden in the former as well as the latter. In other words, what Hamilton is saying is the critics are all wet. Because the fact of the matter is, even the House of Lords and even the legislatures in the particular states in question can't directly involve themselves in a particular decision. All they can do is pass laws making sure that that mistake won't happen again. And then Hamilton points out, hell, the Constitution, Congress can do that. In other words, the criticism Hamilton is saying is bogus. Because Congress can pass a law changing the circumstances in future cases, just like the House of Lords in Parliament, just like the state constitutions. So Hamilton's point is, what's the argument? What's the criticism? There's nothing in the Constitution that forbids Congress from passing a law based on a particular decision which it doesn't like. Consequently, Hamilton is suggesting the criticism of this Constitution is really unfounded. It's bogus. This is the principle, and it applies in all its consequences, Hamilton says, exactly in the same manner and extent to the state governments as to the national government now under consideration. Not the least difference can be pointed out in any view of the subject. So that's the second major criticism that Hamilton has of the anti-federalist critique, presumably written by Robert Yates. And here's the third criticism of that particular quotation, that particular anti-federalist criticism. He says, it may in the last place be observed that the supposed danger of judiciary encroachments on the legislative authority, which has been upon many occasions reiterated, is in reality a phantom. It doesn't exist, guys. It's a straw man. It's intended to scare you away from the Constitution. But it really doesn't exist. And now he's going to say why he believes that the supposed danger of judicial encroachment is in reality a phantom. He says particular misconstructions and contraventions of the will of the legislature may now and then happen, but they can never be so extensive as to amount to an inconvenience or in any sensible degree to affect the order of the political system. This may be inferred with certainty from the general nature of the judicial power, from the objects to which it relates, from the manner in which it is exercised, from its comparative weakness, and from its total incapacity to support its usurpations by force. In other words, what Hamilton is saying as the third major criticism of this anti-federalist criticism of the Constitution is that the fear of judicial usurpation, Hamilton says, is a phantom. It's a farce. It doesn't really exist. It's an illusion. They're just trying to scare you. And he says all you got to do is look at the court and the court's role within this system as defined within the Constitution, and you can see that there are so many reasons why the courts can't threaten the political system that to suggest that the courts would be able to do this is absurd. It's a farce. He says, in effect, he's saying, you want evidence? You want proof? Well, let's look at it. From the general nature of the judicial power, from the fact that the courts don't have any power, from the objects to which it relates, from the manner in which it is exercised, from its comparative weakness, from its total incapacity to support its usurpations of power. In other words, how can it be a threat when it has no power? It has no power to enforce. It depends on support of the other branches to carry out its will. Where is this threat going to come from? Hamilton says. It's a joke. And the inference is greatly fortified by the consideration of the important constitutional check which the power of instituting impeachments in one part of the legislative body and of determining upon them in the other would give to that body upon the members of the judicial department. Basically, he said, all of this weakness that the courts are saddled with is compounded by the fact that if the legislature is really upset by what the court is doing, it can resort to the ultimate power over the independent court, which is impeachment. The House charges for an impeachable offense, and the Senate hears the case. So in a sense then, what we have ultimately in the case of judicial usurpation of power is legislative supremacy, which is the major consideration that prompts the anti-federalist criticism of the Constitution in the first place. This is alone a complete security. There can never be danger that the judges, by a series of deliberate usurpations on the authority of the legislature, would hazard the united resentment of the body entrusted with it, while this body was possessed of the means of punishing their presumption by degrading them from their stations. While this ought to remove all apprehensions on the subject, it affords at the same time a cogent argument for constituting the Senate a court for the trial of impeachments. In other words, the ultimate irony here is that even though the power of impeachment makes this whole thing an absurdity, the fact of the matter is it also speaks for the importance of giving the right to determine impeachments to the Senate. So in other words, what Hamilton is saying is when you look back on the whole thing, what we've got with the independent judiciary is in so many ways the very best. What he's basically doing is talking about or endorsing the wisdom of the framers at the Constitutional Convention. Hamilton is now done. He basically has completed that particular argument, which is to shoot down the Yates criticism of the threat of judicial supremacy. I think if you think about it, he's torn it to pieces. And now he's kind of licking his chops a little bit, and he's saying, I think I pretty well handled that baby. This is the way he says it. He said, having now examined and, I trust, removed the objections to the distinct and independent organization of the Supreme Court, now that we've taken care of that farce, I proceed to consider the propriety of the power of constituting inferior courts and the relations which will subsist between these and the former. In other words, now that we've taken care of that criticism, that phantom, that straw man that the critics of the Constitution are creating, are using to argue against the Constitution, now let's look at the Constitution's language about the power, the judicial power would be vested in one Supreme Court plus as many inferior courts as Congress will choose to create. Let's look at the structure between the federal Supreme Court and the inferior courts, and then let's look at the relations between the two. The power of constituting inferior courts, Hamilton says, is evidently calculated to obviate the necessity of having recourse to the Supreme Court in every case of federal cognizance. Hamilton's opening argument then is the reason the Constitution allows Congress to create inferior courts is in order to make it unnecessary for the Supreme Court to hear every single case that might come up related to the national jurisdiction of the federal court system. In other words, it would be a backlog that would be unbelievable if all cases, all concerns about the various powers of the Constitution and the extent to which state laws and national laws and treaties and laws affecting maritime issues and laws affecting foreign nations, if every case in every one of those areas had to come to the one Supreme Court, the backlog would be, it would never get done. It would be totally dysfunctional. So the reason we have inferior courts is to make it unnecessary for all cases to come to the Supreme Court. It is intended, he says, this particular provision, it is intended to enable the national government to institute or authorize in each state or district of the United States a tribunal competent to the determination of matters of national jurisdiction within its limits. Inferior federal courts are agencies that will hear national issues clearly intended for national jurisdiction short of having to go to the Supreme Court of the United States to get resolution. According to Hamilton, perfectly logical. But why, Hamilton asks, and this, of course, is the key question in this part of the Federalist paper, why, it is asked, might not the same purpose have been accomplished by the instrumentality of the state courts? In other words, why couldn't we just use the state courts? They already exist. Are we just creating federal bureaucracy for the sake of creating it? And Hamilton says this admits of different answers. In other words, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. We have got to justify the creation of inferior federal courts in the face of the fact that state courts already exist. And so that's what he's going to set out to do as in the next portion of Federalist number 80. Though the fitness and competency of those courts, the state courts, should be allowed in the utmost latitude, yet the substance of the power in question may still be regarded as a necessary part of the plan if it were only to empower the national legislature to commit to them the cognizance of causes arising out of the national constitution. In other words, it seems that the national legislature, Congress, could assign issues of national importance to state courts. It would seem to be more efficient. It would be clearly less expensive. So Hamilton believes it's necessary to take this on. And this particular sentence is one that I've highlighted in my hard copy of Federalist number 80 because I think it really warrants serious attention. To confer the power of determining such cases upon the existing courts of the several states, Hamilton says, would perhaps be as much to constitute tribunals as to create new courts with the like power. But ought not a more direct and explicit provision to have been made in favor of the state courts? In other words, clearly it was never intended when the states courts were created that they would deal with these national issues. So that's the first concern. There are, Hamilton says, in my opinion, substantial reasons against such a provision. The legislature could do this. Congress could do this. It could say, we will make the determination as to which cases go to the state courts and which cases go to the Supreme Court, and then we won't need inferior federal courts at all. But now, Hamilton feels the necessity of taking that on. He said, there are, in my opinion, substantial reasons against such a provision. The most discerning cannot foresee how far the prevalency of a local spirit may be found to disqualify the local tribunals for the jurisdiction of national causes. I think all of us can appreciate and understand this. It makes perfect sense. And that would be the inconsistency that exists between local judges embedded with a local spirit being asked to rule on issues of national importance. That can't happen, Hamilton says. It just doesn't make sense. Whilst every man may discover that courts constituted like those of some of the states would be improper channels of the judicial authority of the Union, state judges holding their offices during pleasure or from year to year will be too little independent to be relied upon for an inflexible execution of the national laws. Hamilton's point is, think back to number 78. Think back to the vision and the important duties that Hamilton envisions for the independent judiciary. Now imagine asking state courts and state judges to perform those functions. And Hamilton's whole point is that state judges holding their office during pleasure, in other words, they're not lifetime appointments on the states, they're elected or they're appointed for a certain period of time. By definition, then, they would not be independent enough to perform the role envisioned for them relating to national issues and national laws. And if there was a necessity for confiding the original cognizance of causes arising under those laws to them, there would be a correspondent necessity for leaving the door of appeal as wide as possible. In other words, if we did turn these cases over to local judges who don't have the national perspective and don't have the independence that we require for such decisions, then we would be engulfed with appeal after appeal after appeal after appeal. Because everybody would be able to say, I didn't get the decision we should have gotten because this particular judge is prejudiced. He's local. His spirit is local. He's not up on the latest issues affecting the national and international scene. In other words, there would be justification for an appeal on almost every decision by one side or the other in every single case. So in reality, we would be overwhelmed with appeals. In proportion to the confidence, in proportion to the grounds of confidence in or distrust of the subordinate tribunals, ought to be the facility of difficulty of appeals. In other words, the more qualified, the more independent, and the more substantial the original court or the original judge that hears the case, the less likely it's going to result in an appeal. Because even the losing side is going to realize that all the evidence was heard and the judge making the final determination was the most qualified person. That judge had the training and the expertise and the perspective to make the best decision. In other words, there wouldn't be grounds for an appeal in most cases, Hamilton argues. I'm not sure, Hamilton says, but that it will be found highly expedient and useful to divide the United States. Now what he's talking about is how do we set up these inferior courts? How many of them are there? Where will they be, etc. Now Hamilton is venturing into making recommendations on that score. He says, I'm not sure, but that it will be found highly expedient and useful to divide the United States into 4 or 5 or half a dozen districts and to institute a federal court in each district in lieu of one in every state. In other words, it's not necessary to have a federal court in every state along with the state courts. What we could have is districts. Divide the country into 4, 5, or 6 districts, regions, and have one local or inferior court, federal court, to serve that region and handle the issues that come up in that region that have a national impact. The judges of these courts, Hamilton says, with the aid of state judges, may hold circuits for the trial of causes in the several parts of the respective districts. Justice through them may be administered with ease and dispatch. In other words, what we can have is we can have circuit courts within the districts, where we could have federal judge in combination with state judges ride circuit. In other words, they appear in this state on this particular day, on that state the next week, on the third state the following week. In other words, by appointing circuits, think of how brilliant this is on Hamilton's part, how visionary it is to envision the idea of circuit courts, where you have one court moving around within the district. It can't move around the whole country, but it could move around independent and individual districts. These reasons, it seems, Hamilton says, are sufficient to satisfy a candid mind that the want of such a power would have been a great defect in the plan. In other words, if the Constitution didn't give Congress the authority to create these inferior courts, it would have forced everything to come to the Supreme Court. That would have been a disaster. And he said, I guess we can conclude that this would have been a defect in the Constitution. Now we understand why that provision for inferior courts is there. Now, Hamilton says, let us examine in what manner the judicial authority is to be distributed between the Supreme and the inferior courts of the Union. Now, this gets into the law. This gets into areas where we really need to be talking to attorneys, because this gets into what cases are heard by the inferior courts, what cases would be heard by the Supreme Court. And of course, the more cases come to the Supreme Court, the more concern critics would have about judicial supremacy. By definition, the idea is that even though it's a federal court, if it's regional rather than one court at the top, then people would feel a little bit more comfortable because the decision is being made by judges who are a little bit closer and a little bit knowledgeable to the action, so to speak. The Supreme Court, Hamilton said, the Supreme Court is to be invested with original jurisdiction. In other words, original jurisdiction, and this gets into legal issues that I'm really a little bit uncomfortable in getting into because I'm not an attorney. But the idea of original jurisdiction means that the case goes immediately to the Supreme Court rather than to an inferior federal court first. And what Hamilton is doing is defining the areas where the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. And as we'll see, those areas are very limited. The Supreme Court, Hamilton says, is to be invested with original jurisdiction, quote, only in cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, and those in which a state shall be a party, unquote. The only cases that go directly to the Supreme Court are cases involving foreign dignitaries or cases in which one of the states is a party to the case, to the litigation. Public ministers of every class, now he's justifying this going directly to the Supreme Court. Public ministers of every class, Hamilton says, are the immediate representatives of their sovereigns. All questions in which they are concerned are so directly connected with the public peace that as well for the preservation of this as out of respect to the sovereignties they represent, it is both expedient and proper that such questions should be submitted in the first instance to the highest judiciary in the nation. because consuls and ambassadors and public ministers are representatives of their sovereigns, of other nations, of other governments, it is only makes sense that issues which involve them and affect the sovereignties which they represent needs to go directly to the Supreme Court. Though consuls have not in strictness a diplomatic character, in other words, even though consuls are not diplomats, yet as they are the public agents of the nation to which they belong, the same observation is in a great measure applicable to them. This next sentence I would like you to think about, because this deals with the issue of a case in which a state is one of the parties, is involved. Hamilton says, in cases in which a state might happen to be a party, it would ill suit its dignity to be turned over to an inferior tribunal. Wow. This clearly is Hamilton playing to the vanity of the states and those who advocate state power. What Hamilton is saying is if a state is involved in the issue, in the case, then it ought to be heard by the Supreme Court. Because to assign it to an inferior court would insult the dignity of the state. So the reality is that in both cases in which the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, cases involving foreign ambassadors or representatives, or cases involving a state, in both cases, the reason that case goes directly to the Supreme Court is because of the dignity of the other sovereign, whether that sovereign is another nation or whether that sovereign is one of our own states. This, I would suggest, is Hamilton throwing a little bit of praise in the direction of the states. Now Hamilton is talking specifically about this, and he's talking about the nature of sovereignty itself. However, it's important to mention, and I'm going to do this, this whole issue, he says, it is inherent in the nature of sovereignty not to be amenable to the suit of an individual without its consent. Now he's getting into the question which is in the Constitution about why a state can't be sued unless it consents to be sued. And Hamilton admits that this is an aside. This is not germane to Federalist number 80. This is not germane to the distinction between the Supreme Court and the inferior courts. This is another issue, and Hamilton introduces it here because it comes up when he's talking about the dignity of other sovereignties. He gets into the whole issues of individuals agreeing to be sued or agreeing to be involved. Clearly, this is tangential or not part of Hamilton's whole point in Federalist number 80. He says that. Not only that, but at the end of this paragraph, he opens the next one by saying, let us resume the train of our observations. In other words, what that indicates to me is that the previous paragraph was an aside. It was in quotes or in parentheses or something like that. It's an issue that came up, but on the other hand, it's not really pertinent to the focus of this particular paper, and Hamilton treats it just that way. So Hamilton then goes back to the issue of the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And he says, we have seen that the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court would be confined to two classes of causes, and those of a nature rarely to occur. In all other cases, the federal cognizant, the original jurisdiction, would appertain to the inferior courts, and the Supreme Court would have nothing more than an appellate jurisdiction, quote, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make, unquote. What Hamilton is doing here is trying to alleviate the concerns of the critics, of the anti-federalists, that the power of the Supreme Court means that the judicial branch of government is potentially too powerful. And the way he does that is to point out that the Supreme Court will have original jurisdiction in only two areas. An area in which a foreign representative is involved, or an area in which one of our states is involved. In all other cases, the Supreme Court's role is always appellate, never original. Cases which involve national issues in areas other than those two areas go to the inferior courts. This is obviously intended to relieve the concerns of critics, of the anti-federalists, about the judicial branch. Consequently, now what he's got to do is he's got to get into the appellate jurisdiction of the inferior courts, and he's got to deal with those. We have reached 56 minutes after the hour, so we've only got 2 minutes left in our program today before Rick Smith begins his program at 3 p.m. Rick Smith, as those of you who regularly listen to the Horn know, Rick Smith is on every afternoon, has been for years, at 3 p.m. in the East. He follows us here on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, and it's absolutely essential that we finish on time in order that Rick Smith can begin his program on time. So at 56 minutes after the hour then, let me close by summarizing what we've done today with Federalist number 80. What Hamilton has done is focus the whole thing on the criticism of the judicial branch of government, the criticism of the independent judiciary, coupled with the idea that we could allow a portion of the legislature to do it. That's what they do in Great Britain. That's what they do. That's what we did in some of our state constitutions. And after all, we do allow the Senate to hear cases of impeachment. So even within the Constitution, there's evidence that we let the legislative branch handle a judicial function in the area of impeachments. Consequently, why do we need an independent judiciary? And that's the issue that Hamilton sets out to address in Federalist number 80. I think he does a brilliant job. He uses 3 arguments to refute the criticism of judicial supremacy. Then he gets into the relationship between the Supreme Court and the inferior courts, and he immediately addresses the concerns of the power, about the power of the Supreme Court, by pointing out that the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction in only 2 limited areas, and that in every other area the Supreme Court's power is appellate, not original. All of those cases that involve national issues go to the inferior federal courts and would only come to the Supreme Court on appeal. Again, we have to keep in mind the political nature of the Federalist Papers. The entire thrust of the Federalist Papers is to resolve the criticisms of those who are determined to defeat ratification of the Constitution. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for a wonderful week. Please stay warm and be safe. Take care of each other. Check on your neighbors, because the weather's going to be bitter, bitter cold. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found the time valuable. I thoroughly enjoy it. I hope you did as well. Thank you so much. Be safe, and we'll get together again next week on Monday at the Virtual Center. Thank you.